giardia. If they're full, you absorb 20 times as much calcium and about 10 times as much other nutrients. So he added 5,000 IU vitamin D. 1952, he became a medical maverick. They didn't know what to do with him. He was the very first doctor in North America exceeding the recommended daily allowance by huge quantities. Today, if a doctor did what he did, in 3 weeks he would lose his hospital privileges, and 3 weeks later he would lose his license. They don't put up with it. You got to do as you're told or you're out. Back then they didn't know what to do with this man, so they let him go, and they just called him names. Quack. I'm going to read you guys something here. Quackery is an honor for the men who study science, okay? You know why? Well, let me just point something out to you, okay? We've had some famous quacks in the history of mankind, okay? Real famous quacks. You know who they were? William Hagen. He was the very first doctor to realize that blood was pumped from the heart out to the body extremities. For that theory, they took his license away and called him a quack. Don't be ridiculous, they said. So the very first doctor that thought the heart pumped blood lost his license and was called a quack. William Röntgen, he was called a quack. Now, William Röntgen discovered X-rays and built an X-ray machine. And why was he a quack? Well, they feared his invention would, quote, this the AMA, invade the privacy of the bedroom. William Tenner was the very first doctor who developed vaccine against smallpox. He was called a quack and strongly criticized for supposedly cruel and inhumane experiments on children. My hero is Dalton, the father of chemistry. 1800, he came up with this radical theory called the atomic theory. He said everything's made up of atoms. Are you out of your mind? He lost his tenure to teach at the university. They fired him. They kicked him out. They called him a quack. Don't be silly. 50 years later, they were still debating it, but most scientists said it was a nonsensical theory. At the turn of the century, half the scientists said atomic theory was right and the other half didn't. We had guys like Albert Einstein and Max Planck, the father of physics, all saying the atomic theory was correct, and we had all the leaders of all the universities saying, no, it isn't, and they were fighting him. Now, Albert Einstein, he had the audacity to come up with what we call the theory of relativity. And you've heard about it, but the bottom line is, when he wrote the publication, the scientists at the time were so appalled by it that they all got together at huge expense, hundreds of them, and they wrote a scientific publication called 100 Against Albert Einstein. And when Albert went to present his paper in 1904, their paper was being presented right after his. And just before Albert got up to present his paper on relativity, a young man in the front row jumped up and says, Albert, aren't you going to address what's coming next? 100 Against Albert Einstein? He says, do I have to? He said, yes. He said, well, here's the way it is, son. And this guy was only about 23 at the time, and he called this guy son. He said, if they had been right, one of them would have been enough. They don't need 100. So he got a standing ovation, and it sort of took the wind right out of their sails. And then in 1945, the Royal Canadian Air Force took an atomic clock and flew it around the world, and it lost 7 seconds, proving his theory was correct. And since that time, they proved it and proved it and proved it. That really velocity and time are related inversely. But anyways, bottom line is, he was a quack. There was a man, a doctor, and he's a famous quack because in 1844, his wife gave birth and died. You see, in 1844, one of the 3 women would die giving birth to babies in hospitals. One of the 3. Do you want to go to a hospital and have a baby? But if you stayed home, 1 in 1,000 died. And Dr. Samovai said, it must be something we're doing. Because if they stay home, they don't die. And he said, when we touch them, you see, back in those days, the doctors didn't wash. They came in with street clothes. They usually did autopsies just before all of that, okay? And what happened to them was, they had germs and viruses on their hands. So they didn't know about it, but Dr. Samovai said, listen, there must be something we can't see, so let's scrub our hands. Now, in Budapest, this major hospital started scrubbing the hands, and guess what happens? The women stopped dying. As a matter of fact, only 1 in 2,000 women would die, so 7 other major hospitals took suit. But 5 years before this, your American Medical Association was created, and they dictated that any doctor who believes in spooks, things you can't see, will lose his license. And they told all American doctors, if you wash your hands, you lose your license for quackery. They called it spook quackery. Anyways, they went over to Europe. They lobbied all the other medical associations in Canada, Britain, Germany, France. They descended on Budapest, and 3 weeks later, Simon Weiss found himself at a mental institute where he mysteriously, quote, committed suicide. Doctors in America went back to not washing their hands. 40 years later, millions and millions of American deaths later, 2 men, Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister, the father of germ theory, they had taken microscopes and hooked up cameras to them, and they took pictures of the germs. They then went to the American Medical Association and said, we have pictures of Simon Weiss's spooks. Please let the doctors wash their hands. This is 1884. The American Medical Association said, we need further proof. We have to study it further. And so they would not let doctors wash their hands. By the turn of the century, the whole world was washing their hands. American doctors washed their hands in the closet. If they got caught, they lose their license. American doctors were not allowed to wash their hands until World War I. Let me ask you, in the 80 years where American doctors didn't wash their hands, how many millions of Americans died? That edict from the AMA killed millions and millions of Americans, and they're still doing it. I go on and explain how their policies today are killing millions of Americans, and they make a rule, you cannot challenge them because you do not have medical freedom. Yeah, back in 1876, they were all getting together, forming a constitution, and they did it by drafting and having everything suggested, approved, and rewritten and written. And one doctor sat there and said, okay, guys, I want medical freedom. And he was the only doctor. He was the Surgeon General, Benjamin Rush, Dr. Benjamin Rush, the Surgeon General, said, I want medical freedom. And what that means is all the people can choose any medicine they want, and any doctor can practice any medicine he wants. He also wanted you to have religious freedom. The majority wanted you to become Quakers. They had a vote. By one vote, they decided to give you religious freedom. Dr. Benjamin Rush won. On medical freedom, he lost by 2 votes because Washington was lobbied and changed his vote. And he said, George, you're going to pay for this. And you know what happened to poor George Washington? He did pay for it. A few years later, he got the flu, woke up with headaches, flu-like symptoms, and they did what they did in those days. They let out his blood. Well, when you let blood, your blood pressure drops, and he felt pretty good for a couple hours. But he got sick again, so they let more blood. That made him sicker, so they let more blood. That made him sicker, so what did they do? Well, the doctors of the day liked using mercury packs. So they packed his mouth with mercury compounds. They filled them up until it blistered, and the idea was the blisters would pop and the poisons would come out. That was the theory. Well, that didn't work, so they let out more blood. That didn't work, so they filled his anus with mercury, pumped it up there, and he was pleading for them to kill him by that time. They let out more blood. They let out 7 pints of blood, enough to kill an elephant. George didn't die. He was killed by the AMA, and so on and so on. To get back to the reality of the calcium, in 1982, when Dr. Reich had come to me, he had a stack of paper. It was very heavy and thick, 8 inches high, and he had another little stack of paper about a 1/4 inch high, and official autopsies, it said. And he said, I want you to read this. And not the big stack, the little stack. And I didn't want to read it, but he convinced me.